"Lizette, I hear your story and my heart goes out to you," she said, and continued, "And as a member of Congress and a staffer in Representative King's office, first and foremost, we have to protect the Constitution and enforce the laws." Sounds so clear, doesn't it? We have to enforce the laws. It's the very definition of justice, isn't it? As if these laws are intrinsically just, as if they carry essential truths, things that exist outside of power and politics. What we wouldn't give for that to be true, right? That laws the ink couldn't be spilled on the page unless they were true and honest and loving and just. But laws most definitely exist outside of that limitation. They exist inside of power and politics, and as the power changes, so do the laws. Our country didn't even have a national immigration agency operating until Ellis Island opened in 1892. And once we did, there wasn't a process for how to enter legally. It was only based on the question of who you were if you were allowed to enter. It was your racial or ethnic identity or what you did for a living. You could be excluded or deported if you were Chinese or of Asian descent, if you were a contract worker, a prostitute, or a convicted criminal, or if it seemed likely that you would become a public charge of the state within a year of arriving. There was no legal process. It was just who you were. But at the exact same time, if you were able to live in the United States, even though you were supposed to be excluded, if you could be here and prove that you were here for 1 to 3 years, then you were no longer deportable. Residency outweighed everything else. Aviva Chomsky writes about this history in her book, Undocumented: How Immigration Became Illegal. In 1924, she writes, "They added a stipulation that you had to pass an official health inspection to enter legally. And without it, you could be deported, and it no longer mattered how long you had lived here. Residency did not provide a doorway. Quotas were instituted based on the country of your origin and the size of that population already in the United States. Although the quotas, ironically, only applied to Europeans. But the exemptions that they established also only applied to the Europeans. If you were European and you arrived illegally without an inspection, if you could prove that it would cause economic hardship to your family, your deportation would be waived. And about 200,000 Europeans became citizens this way. But of course, this did not apply to people of Chinese or Asian descent because they were still an excludable group. It wasn't until 1965 that equal quotas were established for people from any nation. And this was the first time that Mexicans were classified as immigrants. 1965. Mexicans didn't even have to enter the US through an official entry point until 1919. US employers wanted it this way. When Congress passed the Literacy Act for immigrants in 1917, Chomsky shared that railroad, agriculture, and mining corporations howled with protest and insisted that an open border was needed and essential in order to obtain the labor forces they needed. And so Congress quickly exempted Mexicans from the literacy requirement. Mexicans hadn't been considered immigrants or people who sought to live in the United States. They were a cheap labor source who migrated back and forth for work. They weren't people who they thought wanted to live among us. They were just people who could buy our products and who could work for us, who could benefit us. They weren't us. Chomsky writes that in the 19th century, Mexico's rail system was designed and planned, constructed by Americans, and they extended American lines into Mexico. And she writes, thus, decisions about Mexico's economy and infrastructure were made in the United States for the benefit of the United States. The railroads also helped bring American products down to sell in Mexico, as well as to bring Mexicans up to and across the border to provide labor. Migration engine flowed directly in response to employee demands in the United States. When they needed workers, employers turned to Mexico, and when they didn't, the State Department instructed offices to increase their enforcement of the likely to become a public charge restriction on would-be immigrants, and they refused to grant them entry. For almost 20 years, the Bracero program existed between the United States and Mexico, recruiting millions of Mexicans to migrate north for seasonal work. 4.5 million contracts were signed. Chomsky shared that one migrant shared, the first words he learned in English were, "Go ahead," from a Border Patrol agent. At the exact same time, the Eisenhower administration authorized the Operation Wetback, 1954, and over 1 million people were deported in these militarized neighborhood sweeps. And some of the people who were deported were even US citizens, because it didn't matter if you had papers, your neighborhood, your community could be raided and just swept away if you looked the part, if you were ethnically Mexican. Braceros were workers with papers, and wetbacks were illegal people. In both cases, they were not us. They were for our benefit. Chomsky wrote that Border Patrol was created right as agribusiness needed migrant labor. The more the workers became deportable, the more they became exploitable. It wasn't until 1965 that the first numerical limit was placed on the number of Mexicans who could cross the border and enter the United States. It was significantly lower than the number of contracts that had been signed just years before with the Bracero program. And just because the law changed didn't mean that the need for laborers changed or the need for a job that paid. And in 1986, Congress saw that this was a problem, and they passed legislation that Mexican immigrants who were in the United States without legal status were allowed to apply for official status if they could prove continuous existence in the country for the past 4 years, or that they had taken part in seasonal agricultural work. 2.3 million immigrants were able to become legal residents through this legislation. 30 years ago, it wasn't 800,000 people, it was 2.3 million. And this is the history that I had been reading on the plane as we were headed towards DC. This is the history that I knew as I was going to these faith advocacy days in DC. It's what I knew when I met Lizeth and our other travel companions at O'Hare. It's what I knew and was digesting as I sat in an advocacy briefing with our trainers, hearing about Trump's administrative goal to raise the Department of Homeland Security's budget by over $1 billion. This is what I knew as we walked into Steve King's office and his legislative director empathized with Lizeth's story and then said, but first and foremost, we have to protect the Constitution and enforce the laws. It's one of the reasons I wanted to yell in anger, and that I still want to yell in anger, because none of this is actually about the sanctity of law, is it? It just isn't. It has never been about the law. The law is a mere symptom of the real phenomenon that is facing our country, the problem of those who have power and resources working to keep the power and resources among themselves. It is the disease of oppression, the disease of racism, the expression of white supremacy. In the United States, legislation around immigration has been the codification of people's perceptions about other groups of people. But not only that, it's about the perceptions that people can use to justify their own behavior to exploit people. And who needs to be exploited and how we understand those people and make them them, it changes over time to be convenient for the people in power. And listening to Lizeth share her story today, and when I heard her sharing it over and over, in DC among our members of Congress or their staffers, sharing the limitations that she had faced, her vision as a child of having to have a job to protect her family. And I recall you saying when the teacher asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Lizette knew she didn't know if all those options would actually be available to her or not, because she knew her fate was uncertain. The pain of living with that as a child and not being able to say that. The fact that she has to stand there and just ask for dignity when she so clearly, that's not something the government, yes, there are systems that can, but Lizette has her dignity in the way that she shares her story and the loving way that she stands for herself without standing against others when she asks for immigration reform. This isn't about her worth or her humanity. This isn't about the humanity of all of these people. It's about the overinflated worth of white people. It's about the overinflated, insidious presence of white supremacy that erases history, even recent history, to construct a story that keeps white people feeling justified and even righteous about their place in society. It is often thinly disguised as colorblindness. It's not about race, it's about authority and the law. It's about fairness, it's about justice. We are all subject to the law. Whether we like it or not, we have to operate in reality. How many times do we hear that, even from a Democrat? Well, we have to function within reality. Yes, we do. But can we, for a moment, just be clear about what the reality is that we're living in? It is not just the symptom of the law, it is the underlying inequity that exists in how people perceive one another and rule the world. There is no such thing as colorblindness. If there were, I wouldn't have seen so many young white men in suits, affluent looking, sitting, eating in the cafeteria at the Capitol alongside us. I would have expected to see the people who look like the cab driver, or the people who were flying the plane, or the people who were making food, or the people walking on the street, but that was absent. It's not color blindness, it is white supremacy blindness. People can't just follow the law and immigrate the right way. Chomsky reminds us, for most of the world's population, many people can't even leave their countries because no one else will let them in. They are poor, they are people of color, and they are denied the right of movement. People are forced to stay in their homelands, no matter how scarce the respect for life or the resources available. If you leave, you are now a criminal. You are the lawbreaker. You are immoral. You become less human, less deserving. You become less us. You become justifiably deserving of exploitation. White supremacy is excellent at misdirecting and reframing issues in a way that justifies the primary normalcy of whiteness. I don't believe that justice is inevitable, or that love will necessarily win, or trump hate. To me, this is almost the same thing as the spiritual platitudes that people say when they say, you're never handed more than you can handle in life, or everything works out for a reason. Those statements drive me insane, and I feel like as a social justice minister, I have to say to you, the arc of the universe is moral and it bends towards justice, but I don't actually believe that anything bends unless we bend it. A member of our community sitting in the back was recently going through a hard time, and I asked, what from your spiritual religious background is supporting you right now? And he said, the fact that there's no essential nature to life, that everything just is what it is, the suchness of life. Life is not inherently just. Life is not inherently unjust. What we make of life is what we make of life. There's no end point, no destination. There's just moving and flowing and living. Living isn't about getting to some destination. It's about living each and every beautiful or boring or searingly painful or joyful moment from one to the next. It's about us choosing how we're going to show up and make life what it is in that moment. It's about us choosing love. It's about us bringing it into being. And then there it is. There is love. When we choose dignity, we bring it to ourselves, and there it is. Dignity isn't something the government is going to hand Lizette. Dignity is something she already brings into this space every time I've heard her speak. When we choose to speak with our legislators, we engage and bring our voices to the conversation. Each moment we wade into that water. And if we don't speak out or act, then that movement of life just keeps going in the shape and flow that it will. And the waters are troubled, my friends. And my friend who shared here this morning, she's in the deep end. And there is no easy answer when I ask her, or when I ask myself, how can I support her? How can I ensure for her the life I want her to have? How often do we talk about our school district not having the minority, who are now majority in our school district, but of all the different languages and cultures that we can create a different educational system, and then yet we're going to not create a process for those people who already live and value being here? We're not going to recruit a ton of people of color to come to Iowa. Come on. We're just not. How do we embrace those who are already here among us, who are talented? When we were in DC, several of our colleagues in the advocacy briefing were saying, what is, the right thing to say? What's the strategy that will really work? What's the best way to lobby? As if there's a right way. There is no surefire strategy. There's only the strategy that if you add to the conversation, then you're a part of it. Over and over again, life just happens. We don't get to know for sure the outcomes of our behavior. There's no end point. There's just the living, the journey, there's the showing up, there's the creating that we get to do in each and every moment with what we bring to the lives we have. Whatever it is that we act, that's what gets enacted. That's what gets embodied. That's what gets to bend the arc. And I don't know how any of this will end, but I know that we can choose to shape it. And it only takes a few hours or a few minutes to show up, to write a letter, to sign a postcard, to go to the city council meeting. Society is a living, breathing, evolving set of indivisible connections. It is a living organism. An organism isn't something to be solved, it's something that lives. So let us do more living than solving. Let us do more improvising, more loving.